There is a woman whose face you have seen more times in your life than the face of your own grandmother. You have seen her on hospital walls, on necklaces, in tattoos on the backs of remorseful criminals, on taxi panels, on altars at the back of humble homes, in golden cathedrals where kings, popes, and emperors knelt. You have seen her crying blood in distant cities. You have seen her appearing in the sky of Fatima, in Lourdes, in Guadalupe. You have seen her carried in processions with millions of people crying at her feet, and yet I assure you, you have never seen her face, because everything they have shown you throughout your entire life was an invention, a mask, a statue so polished by time that no one remembers what existed underneath. You have seen the goddess, you have seen the dogma, you have seen the Queen of Heaven, but the real woman, the one of flesh and blood, the one who was hungry, the one who bled every month, the one who felt fear, the one who probably never learned to read, they hid her from you. And there is a reason for that. There is a very specific, very calculated, and very dangerous reason why the Church spent 2,000 years slowly erasing, with the care of a restorer erasing scribbles from a fresco, all traces of the real woman behind the myth. They changed her name. They changed her age. They changed her social origin. They changed her physical type. They even changed the color of her skin. And even more seriously, they changed the story, the real story, the one that happened in the poor alleys of a village called Nazareth, in the year when Rome collected taxes with whips, and 12-year-old girls were given in marriage to men 2, 3, 4 times older than they were. Her name, to begin with, was not Mary. It was Miriam. And Miriam, before she was a saint, was a girl, a poor girl, a dirty girl, a scared girl, a girl whose father may have sold her, a girl who, at a certain moment in her life, and no one knows exactly how, no one knows exactly why, discovered that she was pregnant, unmarried, engaged to another man, in a society where this literally meant having her skull crushed with stones in the middle of the public square, in front of her own parents. How did she escape? What did she do? Where did she run on that first night when she understood what was happening to her own body? No one tells you that. No one tells you about the terror of an illiterate teenager trying to hide a growing belly. No one tells you about the old carpenter Joseph and the real reason he accepted to stay with her when he could, by law, have handed her over to death. No one tells you about the years she lived in hiding, fleeing in Egypt, supporting a foreign family without speaking the language, in a country where Jews were treated like rats. No one tells you about her real relationship with that strange, intense, disturbing son who grew up saying things that scared even his own mother. No one tells you about the day she tried to forcibly take him out of a crowd because she thought he had gone mad. And it's there, written in a gospel that few read carefully. And above all, no one tells you what happened to Miriam afterward. After the cross, after the tomb, after the apparitions, after the apostles, all men began to organize the new religion and realized with terror that there was still a living witness, a woman. The mother, the one who knew, the one who had seen, the one who had known the son from the first cry to the last breath. And this woman, this uncomfortable witness, needed to be controlled. She needed to be silenced. She needed, somehow, to be transformed into something that could no longer speak. So they turned her into a statue. They turned her into an eternal virgin, a celestial mother, an untouchable queen. They placed her so high, so far away, so divine, that no human being could reach her anymore. And in doing so, they achieved the most brilliant and cruel thing a religious institution has ever done. They took away a woman's voice by turning her into a goddess. This is what no one has told you, and this is exactly what you are going to hear now. You will meet Miriam, the real girl, the Galilean peasant, the scared mother, the silent wife, the woman who saw her son executed and returned home carrying the body. You will hear, perhaps for the first time in your life, the story without the gilding, without the incense, without the Latin, without the fear they taught you to feel every time someone dared to speak of her as a human being. And I warn you, with all the sincerity in the world, if you go to the end of this story, something inside you will change, not your faith. True faith never fears the truth, but your understanding. Your way of looking at that image on the altar of your mother's house, your grandmother's house, your oldest aunt's house. You will never be able to look at a statue of Mary the same way again, because you will be looking now at a girl named Miriam, and she finally will be able to speak. To understand who Miriam was, you first need to forget everything you learned about Mary. Forget the blue cloak, forget the golden halo, forget the serene white European face with light eyes that appeared in Renaissance paintings by Italian artists who never set foot on Jewish soil. Forget the ethereal woman suspended in clouds surrounded by pink cherubs. All of this is invention. All of this came later, much later, and it was painted, sculpted, and indoctrinated by men who desperately needed to transform a Galilean peasant girl into a symbol that could be controlled. The historical truth is much rougher and much more beautiful. Miriam, pronounced Mir-I-Am, with the final accent, as is still heard today in the villages of the Middle East, was born around the year 18 BCE, perhaps 17, perhaps 16. No one knows for sure, because the birth of a girl, at that time and place, did not deserve any record. When a boy was born, the father would throw a small party, offer a sacrifice at the temple, engrave the name of the son in the family memory. When a girl was born, the mother cried in silence, the father received condolences from the neighbors, and the midwife who had helped with the birth would leave without being paid, because bringing a girl into the world was considered a half-service. This is the first fact that no one has told you about Mary. She came into the world as a disappointment. The village where she was born was called Nazareth. You have heard that name your whole life, but I assure you that you never imagined what that place really was. Nazareth in the first century was not a city. It wasn't even a village in the modern sense. It was a cluster of clay and stone houses, squeezed against the slope of a dry hill, in the poorest and most despised region of Galilee. Archaeologists estimate that at most 400 people lived there, perhaps fewer. There was no public square, there was no market, there was no school, there was no doctor, there was no synagogue worthy of the name, just a simple room where men gathered to read the Torah on Saturdays, while women stayed outside, listening through the cracks in the doors. To give you an idea of how irrelevant Nazareth was, consider this. Absolutely no Roman, Greek, or Jewish historical document from that time mentions Nazareth. None. The great Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, who catalogued more than 40 cities in Galilee in his writings, completely ignored Nazareth. The Talmud, the gigantic rabbinic compendium that records names of tiny villages, obscure families, forgotten rabbis, also does not mention Nazareth a single time. It was a place that did not exist. It was a place that no one needed to know existed. It was the kind of place where, when a resident left and went to another city to say where they came from, they would receive a scornful laugh. There is even a passage in the Gospels where a man says with disdain, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" That was the reputation of the place. It was the end of the world. It was the last rung of Jewish society at the time, and it was there that Miriam opened her eyes for the first time. Her house was probably a structure partially dug into the rock of the hill. Archaeologists have found, in modern excavations of Nazareth, dozens of these dwellings, small, dark, with a single opening that served as both door and window. The floor was made of packed earth. The roof was made of branches covered with clay mixed with straw, which meant that on days of heavy rain, water would run inside the house, forming puddles where the bare feet of the residents sank to the ankles. There was no bed. People slept on straw mats spread out on the hard floor, all in the same room. Parents, children, grandparents, cousins, and the animals that belonged to the family. A goat, a sheep, some chickens that would come in at night to protect themselves from the cold and the wolves. You slept breathing the smell of manure. You woke up with the rough tongue of the animal licking your face before dawn. That was Miriam's world. Her family, based on all the sources that have survived, biblical, apocryphal, and later Jewish oral tradition, belonged to a social level that today we would call extreme poverty. There were no rich merchants in Nazareth. There were no temple officials. There were no learned rabbis. There were farmers who rented small plots of land from the large Greek landowners in the region and paid for that land with half of their own harvest. There were carpenters. There were stonemasons. There were women who spun wool to sell in exchange for flour. There was, above all, hunger. A constant, low, persistent hunger that did not kill, but never let anyone forget it was there. Miriam's father, later called Joachim by tradition, was probably one of those tenant farmers. Her mother, named Anna, spun wool and took care of the house. The canonical Gospels do not mention the names of Mary's parents. These names come from an apocryphal text called the Proto-Evangelium of James, written more than 100 years after her death, which means that, in fact, not even the name of Jesus Christ's maternal grandfather has come down to us with historical certainty. Think about that. The largest religion on the planet has huge gaps in its own family genealogy. Miriam's life, from the first day she could stand, was an uninterrupted succession of work. At 3, she was already carrying small bundles of twigs to the clay oven where her mother baked bread. At 5, she was learning to spin wool with her small fingers, holding the spindle while her mother patiently corrected the knots that formed in the thread. At 7, she would fetch water from the village well, 2, 3, 4 times a day, carrying clay jars that weighed almost the same as her own body. At 10, she was already kneading bread, grinding wheat, milking the goat, sewing patches on her brother's tunics. At 12, she was considered, by Jewish law, an adult woman, ready to marry, ready to be given away. And here is another fact you need to absorb to understand the rest of this story. In first-century Jewish society, a girl was considered eligible for marriage from the age of 12 and a half. That was the minimum limit. In some cases, engagements were made earlier, when the girl was 11, 10, even 9 years old. The negotiations were made exclusively between the parents and the groom, with no participation from the girl. She had no say. She did not know the man she would marry, in most cases, until the day he appeared in front of her father's house to shake hands and finalize the contract. She had no right to refuse, she had no right to delay. She did not even have the right to cry in public, because crying in front of the arrival of the groom was considered a disgrace to the family. Imagine for a moment what that meant in the skin of a girl. Imagine waking up every day knowing that at some point a man you have never seen will appear at that door. This man could be 18 years old, he could be 30, he could be 50, he could be 70, he could be handsome. He could be repulsive, he could be kind, he could be violent. He could have had other wives who died, he could have diseases, he could have permanent bad breath, and at the moment your father shakes his hand, you will belong to him. Forever. No turning back. No divorce possible at your initiative. You will sleep with him on the first night, even if you do not fully understand what will happen to your body. You will have children by him, one after another, until you die in childbirth or until you age at 30 and are replaced by a younger wife. That was the fate that awaited Miriam. And she, like all the other girls in Nazareth, was being prepared for that fate from her first steps. She learned to obey. She learned to lower her eyes when a man passed in the street. She learned to cover her hair when she left the house. She learned to speak softly. She learned not to laugh loudly. She learned that her body did not belong to her. It belonged first to her father, then to her husband, and never, at any moment, to herself. But there was something more in Miriam, something that the oldest sources, even those written centuries later, let slip between the lines. A quietness, a depth, a silence different from the silence imposed on other girls. The apocryphal texts describe her as a child who spent hours looking at the sky without saying a word, who knew, without anyone teaching her, which herbs cured fever and which worsened the illness, who was able to calm crying babies just with the touch of her hand, who had dreams, strange dreams, dreams that she whispered only to her mother and that made Anna cross herself in silence before sending her daughter to sleep. Legends, perhaps, later embellishments almost certainly, but even the legends, when read with attentive eyes, reveal a girl who within that grey and harsh world carried a difference, an intensity, a sensitivity that in another time, in another place, could have made her a poet, a prophetess, a mystic, a spiritual leader. But that there, in Nazareth, in the year 4 or 3 BCE, only meant one thing. She would be considered strange by the neighbors, and perhaps sold for less because strange girls were harder to marry. And it was around the time she turned 12, perhaps 13, that her life changed. Joseph appeared one night at home, sat in front of the fire, ate the bread that Anna had baked, and, with a low voice and his eyes fixed on the ground, told his wife that he had spoken with a man, an older man, a carpenter from another nearby village, an honest, hard-working man, said to be a descendant of the royal lineage of David, although that lineage had lost its fortune and power centuries before. The man's name was Joseph. Joseph. Anna raised her eyes. She looked at Miriam, sitting in a corner, sewing the hem of a tunic, and she began to cry in silence. Because that night, without anyone needing to explain with words, everyone in that house knew what had just happened. The life of the girl Miriam had come to an end. And now, without her knowing, the long journey that would transform her 2,000 years later into the most revered woman in human history was beginning. Joseph was not young. This is the first detail that the Church, for centuries, did everything to soften, distort, or when it could not, simply not mention. In the Renaissance paintings, you know, Joseph appears as a mature man, yes, but still vigorous, with a well-groomed grey beard, serene eyes, strong hands holding a flowering rod, a man in his 40s, at most 50, an acceptable husband for a young woman. Forget that image. The oldest traditions prior to the institutional censorship of the church councils describe Joseph as an old man. In some apocryphal texts, he is presented as a widower with grown children from a previous marriage. In others, he is between 70 and 90 years old at the time he marries Miriam. The Proto-Evangelium of James, written around the year 150, states that Joseph would have been 80 years old when he received Miriam in his home. Even discounting the pious exaggeration of this text, even applying all possible historical skepticism, the conclusion is uncomfortable. Joseph was at the very least 3 or 4 decades older than his bride. At that time, this was not a scandal. It was the norm. The logic of first-century Jewish marriage was brutally practical. A man needed to accumulate wealth before he could support a wife. He needed to have his workshop, his tools, his house, his reputation in the village. All of this took decades. Therefore, it was common for men to marry for the first time around 30-35 years old, with girls of 12 or 13. When these men became widowers, which happened with terrible frequency because women died young, usually in childbirth they would look for brides again. And the brides, of course, continued to be girls of 12 or 13, always. That's how the machinery worked. Joseph, therefore, within that logic, was a desirable husband, not rich but stable. He had his carpentry workshop, although the Greek word used in the Gospel, tekton, meant more properly builder, someone who worked with both wood and stone, doing a bit of everything. Doors, carts, walls, roofs, simple furniture. He was a man who earned his bread with calloused hands, but he earned it. He had a roof. He had an oven. He had a respected, albeit obscure, name. And he belonged at some distant point in the family tree to the lineage of King David, which, at that time and place, did not bring money, but gave a certain silent pride when entering a synagogue. Joachim, Miriam's father, considered the proposal for days. He spoke with the village elders. He spoke with the rabbi. He spoke, above all, with his own wife, in nighttime whispers, after the children had gone to sleep. Anna hesitated. Anna always hesitated. But Anna knew, as every Jewish mother of that time knew, that refusing a legitimate marriage proposal was condemning her daughter to the worst of all fates, spinsterhood. A woman who was over 15 years old without marrying was officially considered spoiled goods. No one would want her anymore. She would live as a burden in her father's house until he died, and then she would become a burden in her brother's house, enduring the disdain of her sisters-in-law, until she also died, thin and bitter, having never known a home of her own. It was better Joseph. It was better the old carpenter with cracked hands but honest. It was better the man who, according to everyone, had never hit his first wife while she lived. It was better the simple house in Nazareth, close to her parents, than the absolute unknown that would come with the refusal. And so the engagement was formalized. The Jewish engagement ceremony in the 1st century was completely different from what we imagine today. It was not a light announcement, a romantic promise between two passionate people. It was a heavy legal contract called kiddushin or irusin that had almost the full force of marriage. Once the engagement was signed, the bride became, from a legal standpoint, the wife of the groom. She continued living in her parents' house for a few more months, usually between 6 months and a year, while the groom prepared the house to receive her. But during this entire transition period, she already belonged to him. If she died before consummation, he would be officially a widower. If he died, she would be officially a widow. And above all, if she were found with another man during that interval, she would be considered an adulteress, and an adulteress, according to the law of Moses, was punished with death, stoning, in front of everyone, in front of her own parents. It is essential that you understand this detail because it explains the absolute terror that would come later. It was in this interval, between the engagement and the consummation, between her father's house and her husband's house, that something happened to Miriam. Something that the Bible describes in few, vague, distant, almost silent words. Something that, 2,000 years later, still divides theologians, historians, doctors, anthropologists, psychoanalysts, and anyone who delves into the texts with honest eyes. Something that, depending on how you look at it, was the greatest miracle in human history, or the greatest silenced tragedy in human history, or perhaps, and this is the most unsettling, both things at the same time. But before I take you to that night, and I will take you, I promise, with all the details that survived in the gaps of the texts, I need to pause here for a moment, because what comes next will require something different from you, not just attention, courage. And while you prepare internally for that, I want to ask you a question, a direct question, looking into your eyes on the other side of this screen. Have you ever stopped to think how many women throughout human history have had their stories stolen, rewritten, buried under doctrines invented by men? Not just Miriam, not just the mother of that specific man, but all of them, all mothers, all daughters, all silenced witnesses. How many millions of true stories have been erased so that a handful of official versions could survive? I want you to write now, in the comments, the name of a woman in your family, your mother, your grandmother, your great-grandmother, your aunt, whose story you feel no one has ever told properly. A silenced woman in your own family tree. Because I assure you there is at least one. There is always at least one. And while you think about that, let me ask you one thing with all sincerity. You know that this kind of content, this kind of story, told the way it deserves to be told, without censorship, without gilding, without fear, does not appear on open television, does not appear in Sunday sermons, does not appear in textbooks. It only exists here, and it only continues to exist if people like you support people like us. So, if you are feeling at this moment that what you are hearing matters, that it needs to be heard, that it needs to reach other people, I ask you for one simple thing. Click on the subscribe button. Activate the bell. Be part of this circle of people who still have the courage to face history head-on, because from the next section, things will get dense. It will get beautiful, but it will get dense. And I want you by my side when we enter there. Now, let's return to Miriam. Let's return to that 13-year-old girl, newly engaged to an old man she barely knew, still living in her parents' house, still sleeping on the straw mat next to her younger sister, still waking up before dawn to grind wheat, fetch water, feed the goat. Let's return to the strange months of Irusin, when she was officially the wife of a man she was not yet living with, when she carried in her hand the simple ring, probably just a pierced bronze coin tied with a cord, that marked her new condition. The neighbors looked at her with more respect now. The other girls envied her a little. Her mother spoke to her in a different tone, teaching her things she had never taught before, how to recognize the cycles of the moon within her own body, how to care for a sick husband, how to calm an irritated man after a bad day, knowledge that every woman of that time needed to have, and that every woman of that time learned too late. It was in that suspended period, in that limbo between girl and woman, that Miriam began to dream. The apocryphal texts richly describe these dreams. In some, she flew over the desert. In others, she spoke with a luminous figure whose face she could not distinguish. In others still, she dove into a bottomless well and discovered, at the bottom, not death, but a vast night sky full of stars. Legends, of course. Embellishments. Pious additions from the generations that came after and wanted to fill the silence of the canonical Gospels with something more moving. But even within these legends, there is a curious core that repeats. Miriam, before the angel, before the conception, before any miracle, was already a different girl, a dreamer, restless, perhaps a seer, touched by something she herself could not name. And it is at this point, precisely at this point, that the most delicate historical problem of her entire life enters, because at some moment between the engagement and the consummation of the marriage, Miriam discovered, or was forced to discover, or began to slowly realize day by day with terror growing inside her chest, that she was pregnant, and she had not known any man. Or had she? But she could not say. Or she did not quite know what had happened. Or she knew. And the truth was so impossible, so immense, so violent, so sacred, that it could not fit into human words. The canonical Gospels resolve this issue with a single, very brief scene known as the Annunciation. An angel, Gabriel, appears to her. He says she will be a mother. She responds with a phrase that has become famous, "Let it be to me according to your word." And that's it. End of the scene. Nothing more is said about what she felt, what she thought, what she lived in the hours, days, and weeks that followed. But think with me for a moment. A 13-year-old girl, newly engaged, still living with her parents, discovers she is pregnant. In that society, under that law, in a village where everyone knows each other, where nothing is hidden, where the belly within a few months would begin to grow, visible, denunciatory, fatal. What did she do in those first days? Who did she tell first? How did she look into her mother's eyes? How did she look into her father's eyes? And above all, how did she look into Joseph's eyes? The night Miriam discovered she was pregnant is not in any gospel. None of the 4 canonical texts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, describe this moment. Mark and John simply do not mention the childhood or conception of Jesus. They start the story with the adult, by the Jordan River, being baptized. Matthew dedicates a few lines to the conception, but writes it from Joseph's point of view. It is Joseph who dreams of an angel. It is Joseph who receives the explanation. It is Joseph who decides what to do. Miriam, in Matthew, is practically a narrative object, a figure spoken of but who does not speak. Only Luke tries to enter her perspective. And even Luke, writing probably between the years 80 and 90 of the Common Era, that is more than half a century after the facts, and having never personally known Miriam, offers only the simplified scene of the Annunciation, without any emotional depth, without any description of what happened in her body, in her head, in the weeks that followed. The Gospels, in other words, do not want you to think about this. They give you the theological answer, already prepared, wrapped up, with the bow tied, and push you forward. Yes, she became pregnant. Yes, it was the work of the Holy Spirit. Yes, she said, "Let it be." Next scene, Bethlehem, stable, shepherds, wise men. Let's move on. But human history does not work that way. Human history, when you dig beneath the surfaces, is always dirty, complicated, slow, full of pauses, fears, calculations, necessary lies. And Miriam's story, beneath all the layers of dogma applied on top of it, is one of the most human of all. Think about how a 13-year-old girl in the 1st century would discover she was pregnant. She did not have a written menstrual calendar. She counted the cycles by the moon, by the days between one purification water and another. She did not have a pharmacy test, did not have a blood test, did not have an ultrasound. She perceived pregnancy as all women in history perceived pregnancy before modern medicine. By the delay, by morning sickness, by the strange weight in her breasts, by the sudden aversion to certain smells, the smell of roasting fish, the smell of boiling milk, the smell of her own father returning from work. By the feeling, even before any visible sign, that something inside her had changed in nature, that she was no longer alone in her own body. And upon realizing this, she would have felt fear. Not common fear, absolute fear, fear of death, because the law was clear. The book of Deuteronomy, chapter 22, prescribed in detail what should be done with a bride found pregnant before the consummation of the marriage, if it were proven that she had known another man. She should be taken to the door of her father's house, and there on the threshold, at the threshold of the house where she was born, she should be stoned to death by the men of the city. The stoning should be primarily inflicted by the betrayed groom first, and then by the other men in sequence. The body should remain exposed until sunset, as a warning to the other girls in the village. This was the real scenario that lay ahead of Miriam. There was no angel floating in her room with reassuring explanations. There may have been the dream. I cannot affirm or deny the mystical experience she lived, and everyone can believe in it according to their personal faith. But the dream did not free her from material reality. The dream would not convince Joseph. The dream would not convince Joachim. The dream would not convince the village elders who would gather to judge the case. The dream was hers, and she was alone with it. What went through that girl's mind in those first days? She would have thought, before anything else, about fleeing. Every woman in the history of humanity who found herself in a similar situation thought about fleeing at some point. She thought about where to go, with what money, with what documents. At that time, a woman could not travel alone. There was no public transport. There was no accommodation for unaccompanied women. A woman alone on a first-century road was at the mercy of bandits, Roman soldiers, merchants, any man who found her and wanted to do with her as he pleased. Fleeing would mean, at best, dying of hunger. At worst, dying of things worse than hunger. She would have thought about aborting. Yes, and the church would prefer you not to know this, but abortion was a known practice in the ancient world, including among the Jews. There were herbs. There were older women who knew how to prepare specific infusions, pennyroyal, rue, certain seeds, certain roots. Every rural community had its midwife healer who knew these secrets, passed down in whispers from mother to daughter for centuries. Miriam would have known at least one of these women in Nazareth, and she would have weighed at some point in those long nights when sleep did not come, whether it was worth seeking her out, whether the soul of whatever was inside her, whatever it was, deserved the chance to exist at the cost of her own life. She would have thought about killing herself. This is the most painful thought of all, but it is the thought that every abandoned woman with an impossible pregnancy has had at some point in history. And Miriam, with all the sensitive depth that even later legends recognize in her, certainly spent at least one night looking at the clay ceiling and considering, even if for a moment, what kind of rope existed at home, what kind of well, what kind of end would be quicker. But she did none of that. She did not flee, did not abort, did not kill herself. She made a much more complex, much braver, much more dangerous decision. A decision that 2,000 years later still makes us stop and think about what it truly means to be courageous. She decided to tell. But she did not tell in Nazareth. Not first. The Gospels record, with curious precision, that as soon as Miriam learned of her pregnancy, she packed a small bundle with some clothes and set off alone on a journey of approximately 150 kilometers, crossing mountains, valleys, dangerous roads, to the house of a cousin named Elizabeth, who lived in a village in the hills of Judea. Think about that. Think of a 13-year-old girl, pregnant, walking alone for 150 kilometers in the first century. It would take days, perhaps an entire week. She would have to sleep by the roadside, hide from travelers, beg for food at wells, avoid the gazes of Roman soldiers. And she did that. She chose to do that. Why? The canonical answer is to help Elizabeth, who was also pregnant, according to Luke, with the child who would become John the Baptist. The deeper, more human answer is probably another. She needed to get out of Nazareth before her belly began to show. She needed time. She needed someone to talk to. She needed an older woman, a relative, trustworthy, away from the eyes of the neighbors, the eyes of her father, the eyes of Joseph, to open her soul and try to understand what the hell was happening to her. And it was at Elizabeth's house, in the hills of Judea, that Miriam stayed for 3 months. 3 whole months. Think about what those 3 months meant. It was the time she hid her pregnancy from the world. It was the time she talked, day after day, with an older, wise woman, married for decades, who knew secrets that the girls of Nazareth did not know. It was the time she tried, perhaps together with Elizabeth, to construct a narrative, an explanation, some version of the story that could be presented when she returned home. It was the time she built, within herself, the courage necessary to face Joseph, to face her father, to face the village, to face the very real possibility of being stoned to death in the coming weeks. And it was also the time when she, perhaps, began to believe. Believe in what, exactly, is the mystery that will never be solved. Believe that this pregnancy came from something divine. Believe that she had been chosen. Believe that the dream, if there was a dream, had not been a hallucination, but a message. Believe, above all, that if she told the naked truth, the way she felt it, someone, perhaps Joseph, perhaps God, perhaps both, would find a way to believe her. 3 months later, she returned to Nazareth. The belly was already visible, still small, but perceptible to attentive eyes. The neighbors noticed almost immediately. The whispers began. The women who went to fetch water at the well fell silent when she arrived. The mothers pulled their daughters to the other side of the street. The village rabbi was certainly informed within a few days. And at some point during those first weeks after her return, Joseph went to Joachim's house. The Gospels do not describe this conversation. They skirt around it, abbreviate it, replace it with a scene of a nighttime dream in which an angel appears to Joseph and explains everything. But think for a moment about the real human scene. Think of Joseph, the old carpenter, receiving the news that his fiancée, the girl for whom he had paid a dowry, for whom he had prepared a house, for whom he had waited months, was pregnant, and not by him. What did Joseph feel? What did Joseph think of doing? This is one of the densest moments in the entire story, and it is at this moment, precisely at this one, that the true nature of each of the characters in this story began to reveal itself. Joseph had the right to have Miriam killed. This is a phrase that needs to be said in full because later theology did everything to soften it, blur it, hide its harshness behind soft words. But the legal truth of the first century is exactly this. As the legal fiancé, before the religious court and before the community, Joseph had the right, and according to the strictest interpretation of the law, the duty, to publicly denounce his bride for adultery, present the case to the elders, and personally participate in the execution by stoning, throwing the first stone. That was the procedure. That was the custom. That was the way of the honorable man, the man who defended his family's name, the man who would not accept being ridiculed before the village. And Joseph did not do that. He did not do that. And the entire history of Christianity exists only because he did not do that. Think about it, because it is a dizzying thought. If Joseph, at that moment, on that specific night when he received the news, had followed the path that the law and tradition expected of him, Miriam would have been executed in a few days. Her womb would have been opened by stones. The child growing inside her would have died with her, and none of the next 2,000 years would have happened. No church, no cross, no cathedral, no Christmas, no Easter, nothing. The entire history of the West, the entire history of more than 2 billion people on the planet today, was decided by a single silent choice made by an old man alone inside a clay house in a forgotten village in Galilee. What went through Joseph's mind that night? The canonical Gospels once again simplify. They say that Joseph, being a just man and not wanting to infame Miriam, decided to send her away secretly without publicly denouncing her. This would mean, in practice, giving her a private letter of repudiation, returning her to her father's house, and pretending that the engagement had never existed. She would be dishonored, yes, but alive. He would lose the dowry paid, have his reputation stained, but at least he would not have blood on his hands. It was the middle ground, the way out for someone who had neither the courage for total mercy nor for total cruelty. And then, the Gospels say, an angel appeared to Joseph in a dream and told him to accept Miriam because the pregnancy was from God. I confess something to you. I, telling this story, with all the honesty I owe to you who are listening to me, have no way of knowing what really happened that night in that man's mind. Perhaps he really dreamed. Perhaps he had a vision. Perhaps he heard a voice. Perhaps he simply looked at the ceiling of his own house for hours, weighed all the options, calculated all the consequences, and made a rational, pragmatic, deeply human decision, which he later, years later, telling the story to the first disciples, attributed to divine intervention, because that was how men of that time explained decisions that seemed too great for a man alone to make. But whatever the reason, Joseph made the decision. He accepted Miriam. He went to Joachim's house a few days later, sat before the old farmer, ate the offered bread, drank the wine, and said in a low voice, without looking his father-in-law in the eye, "I will receive your daughter into my house. As agreed, there will be no rupture." Joachim, according to tradition, cried with relief, cried with gratitude, cried for the life of the daughter who had been saved. Cried because he knew better than anyone that if that old man had decided otherwise, he himself, Joachim, might have been forced to participate in the execution of his own daughter, throwing a stone with a trembling hand right there on the threshold of his own house. The consummation of the marriage was anticipated. Miriam was brought, in a quick, almost silent ceremony, without the usual 7-day feast, without the procession through the village, without the songs of the other women, to Joseph's house. There was no reason for public celebration. Her belly was already too big to be disguised, and any celebration would have been a cause for mockery. The neighbors knew, the elders knew, the rabbi knew, and everyone, in silence, accepted the arrangement, because Joseph was a respected man, and Joachim was a respected man, and there were things that in the first century as today simply were decided not to be said aloud. But the whispers continued. And the whispers in that village never completely faded away. There is a terrible detail in the canonical Gospels themselves, which few people notice when reading, but which is there, screaming from the page for those who have ears to hear. Years later, during Jesus' public ministry, when he returned to Nazareth to preach, the villagers received him with a phrase that seems like praise, but is, in fact, an ancient insult, resurrected, thrown in his face. They said, according to the Gospel of Mark, "Isn't this the son of Mary? Son of Mary. Son of the mother, not son of Joseph, as would be normal in that patrilineal culture. Son of the mother," which, in the popular insult of that time, was the exact equivalent of calling someone a bastard. Calling an adult man son of the mother in Nazareth in the 1st century was to publicly declare that he had no known father. It was to spit in his face the old story, the story never forgotten, the story that the village elders had silently accepted decades before, but which had never at any moment ceased to be whispered on long afternoons under the fig trees. That was the weight that Miriam carried, not for months, not for years, for a lifetime. Every time she went to the well, every time she went to the market, every time she entered the synagogue and sat in the space reserved for women, she knew that glances crossed behind her back. She knew that mothers lowered their voices when she passed. She knew that some women, when crossing paths with her, discreetly made the old gesture against the evil eye. She raised the child and then more children, because yes, she had other children, and we will get to that, under the constant weight of a suspicion that was never explicitly accused but was never explicitly forgiven. And this is where one of the most disturbing and most silenced aspects of the whole story comes in. Later, Christian tradition, starting in the 2nd century, began to defend that Miriam remained a virgin forever, not just until the birth of Jesus, virgin before, during, and after. And not only that she never had relations with Joseph, and that Joseph never had relations with any woman, neither before nor after marrying her. That the brothers of Jesus mentioned in the canonical Gospels, James, Joseph, Judas, Simon, in addition to the sisters whose names were not preserved, were not biological children of Miriam, but cousins or children from a previous marriage of Joseph, or simply brothers in a spiritual sense. Why this insistence? Why did they need in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century to transform a woman who clearly had a normal family life, described in the sacred texts themselves, into a perpetual virgin, untouchable, without sex, without a real body? The answer is so delicate that for centuries it was forbidden even to formulate it aloud. They needed to erase Miriam's body because Miriam's body was the central problem of the new religion. If Miriam were an ordinary woman, married with children with a normal sex life, then the birth of Jesus could be questioned. If the birth of Jesus could be questioned, the entire theology of the Incarnation would be at risk. And more deeply, if an ordinary woman could give birth to God in her womb, it meant that ordinary women, that is, all women, had some degree of spiritual power over the sacred, and this, for a church that was being built by men, that was being organized by men, that was being regulated by men, was an absolute danger. So they did the only thing they could do. They ripped Miriam's body away from her. They turned her into an eternal virgin. They placed her on a cloud. They dressed her in blue. They sculpted her smile in smooth marble, without wrinkles, without scars, without the sweat of childbirth, without the blood of menstruation, without the milk dripping from her breast, without anything that could remind anyone that she had once been a real woman, in a real body, living a real life. And the Miriam that existed, the scared girl, the silent wife, the tired mother, the widow hardened by life, was buried, layer by layer, under 2,000 years of marble, gold, and dogma. But before being buried, she lived, and lived a lot. And it is the life she lived, after that improvised marriage, after that move to Joseph's house, that we will follow now. Joseph's house was located in the lower part of the village, near the only well in Nazareth. It was a building slightly larger than those of the neighbors, because he had worked his whole life to build it with his own hands. It had 2 rooms, an extraordinary luxury for the region, where almost all families lived in a single space. The first room in front served as both workshop and kitchen. There were wooden benches, tools hanging on hooks on the wall, a clay oven embedded in the floor, jars of oil and flour lined up in a corner. The second room at the back was the bedroom, small, dark, with a single high opening for ventilation, and 2 straw mats rolled up during the day and spread out at night. It was in this second room that Miriam, at just over 13 years old, slept for the first time next to a man. What happened that first night? The Gospels do not say. Later theology, in fact, fervently insists that nothing happened. That Joseph, out of respect for the mystery of the pregnancy, never touched Miriam. That he received her as a wife only in the legal sense, but that they slept on separate mats in absolute chastity until the end of their lives. This is the version that crystallized in the councils, that was painted in stained glass, that was preached from the pulpits. But the human story was probably different. The original Greek text of the Gospel of Matthew contains a curious expression, often disguised in modern translations. It says that Joseph did not know her until she gave birth to her firstborn son. The key word here is until. In Greek, theoso. This linguistic construction, in all other contexts in which it appears in the New Testament, clearly indicates a temporal milestone after which the described situation changes. In other words, the Gospel of Matthew is directly telling those who read in Greek that Joseph abstained from Miriam until the birth of the child, and that after that the marital relationship became normal. This, by the way, is the most natural reading of the text, and it was the reading accepted by many of the early church fathers before the dogma of perpetual virginity was consolidated centuries later. And it makes human sense that it was so. Joseph was an ordinary man. He was not an ascetic. He was not a priest. He was not a monk. Because, by the way, there were no monks in first-century Judaism. He was a village carpenter, a man who needed a companion, children, family. He had received in his house illegally his wife. That he had a normal marital life with her after the birth of the first child is, in fact, the simplest and most sensible hypothesis. The Gospels themselves confirm this indirectly by naming 4 brothers of Jesus, James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon, and also mentioning the existence of sisters in the plural without naming them. Miriam was therefore the mother of at least 7 children, perhaps more. This is a detail that official iconography has never shown you. You have never seen a painting, a statue, a stained glass window showing Miriam surrounded by 6 or 7 children running around her, shouting, fighting, getting dirty with dirt, pulling at the hem of her dress, demanding food. You have always seen her solitary, with a single baby in her arms, in a serene pose, in absolute silence. This image is a later fabrication. The historical Miriam was, most likely, a busy, exhausted mother of a large family, divided between caring for the strange firstborn and the younger children who came in quick succession during the next 10 or 15 years. But that came later. Let's go back to the first pregnancy, to the months that followed the move to Joseph's house. The belly was growing, and, along with the belly, fear was growing. Not the fear of stoning and that had already passed now that she was under the legal protection of her husband. The fear now was different. It was the fear of childbirth. And at that time, in Nazareth, the fear of childbirth was the greatest fear a woman knew. For you who are listening now in the 21st century, it may be difficult to gauge what it was like to give birth in the 1st century. It is estimated, based on archaeological data and ancient medical records, that between 20 and 30% of women died as a result of childbirth complications throughout their reproductive lives. 20 to 30%. If you add that to an infant mortality rate that exceeded 50%, that is, more than half of live-born children died before the age of 5, you begin to understand what it meant to become pregnant in that world. Becoming pregnant was betting one's life. Becoming pregnant was writing, on one's own body, a check that neither you nor the baby might be able to pay. Miriam knew that. Every girl in Nazareth knew that. She had seen women in her family die in childbirth. She had seen babies born bluish and silent. She had seen midwives come out of rooms with bloodied hands and downcast eyes, telling the husband waiting outside in a barely audible voice that it had not been possible to save either the mother or the child. It was with that dread, present in every movement of the baby inside her, in every little kick in the late afternoon, in every heartburn in the early morning, that Miriam went through the final months of her first pregnancy. And it was at that exact moment, precisely then, that the Roman Empire decided to intervene in her and Joseph's lives. A decree came from Rome, one of those cold, distant administrative decrees signed by a ruler named Caesar Augustus, who would never know of the existence of a village called Nazareth, would never know of the existence of a girl named Miriam, would never imagine that his simple bureaucratic order would change the entire history of the world. The decree was for a census. The entire population of the territories subjected to Rome was to be counted, registered, catalogued, mainly for tax collection purposes. And according to the interpretation that Rome made of Jewish law in that region, each head of household was to register in the ancestral city of their lineage. For Joseph, a descendant of the house of David, the ancestral city was Bethlehem. Bethlehem was 150 kilometers from Nazareth. Walking, with the roads of that time, it would take at least 4 to 5 days, climbing mountains, crossing deserts, sleeping in the open. And Miriam, in the 9th month of pregnancy, with her belly already so big that she could barely tie her sandals by herself, would have to go along, because the census registration required the presence of the entire family unit. Imagine this journey. Imagine a 14-year-old girl, because she was approximately that age at the time she gave birth, according to the most accepted historical estimates, crossing mountains in the 9th month of pregnancy, on a donkey if she was lucky, on foot for part of the journey for sure, because the paths were too steep for an animal to carry a heavy pregnant woman up the slopes. They set out, according to tradition, at the beginning of the Jewish winter. The nights were cold, the roads were muddy, the bandits were many. Joseph, at 50, 60, perhaps 70 years old, with knees already battered from decades of carpentry, walked alongside the donkey, holding the reins, stopping every few minutes to ask Miriam if she could continue. They slept in crowded inns, sharing with other families, with foreign merchants, with drunken Roman soldiers. They ate what they could, hard bread, goat cheese, some dried dates kept at the bottom of the bag. Miriam, in the advance of her pregnancy, could not eat much. The weak contractions had already begun, according to later descriptions. Those first, intermittent warnings that every pregnant woman recognizes as the sign that the body is preparing. They arrived in Bethlehem on the 4th or 5th night of walking, and Bethlehem was crowded. Hundreds of descendants of the house of David, coming from all corners of Galilee, Judea, Perea, Idumea, had converged on the small town. Every inn was packed. Every distant relative's house already had 3 families camping in the yard. Joseph knocked on door after door. He asked, he insisted. He showed his wife almost in labor, and received at every door the same answer: there is no room. It was a man, no one knows who. Later tradition attributes it to a charitable innkeeper who, upon seeing the girl doubled over in pain on the donkey, with Joseph already crying at her side, offered the only space he still had available, a cave dug into the rock just behind the inn, where the guests' animals were kept at night. And it was in that cave, on the dirty straw floor covered in dung, with the smell of animals around, with the biting cold of a winter night coming through the doorless opening, that Miriam, a 14-year-old girl, alone, exhausted, with only her old husband for company and no experienced midwife to help, began to give birth to her first child. There was no shining star that night, at least not in Miriam's immediate experience. The star, the angels singing in the heavens, the shepherds running from the hills, the wise men from the east, all of this is later theological narratives constructed by the evangelists decades later to place the birth of that baby within a cosmic prophetic grand context. For Miriam, on the real night, there was none of that. There was pain, there was blood, there was cold. There was the strong smell of fermented dung. There was the absolute silence of the world outside, indifferent, ignorant, that in that cave a 14-year-old girl was fighting alone against her own body. Childbirth in the 1st century was a brutal thing. There was no anesthesia, there were no painkillers, there was no hot water in abundance, no sterilization, no gloves, no scalpel in case an emergency cesarean was needed. And by the way, if it were needed, the mother would die, because cesareans at that time were performed only on women already dead, to try to save the baby. The midwife, when there was one, worked with her hands washed in cold water and oil. She cut the cord with a sharp blade on the stone. She sutured, when necessary, with a bone needle and tendon thread. All of this in the dim light of an oil lamp, with the smell of burning oil mixing with the smell of blood. Miriam had no midwife in Bethlehem. This detail later tradition has circumvented in various ways, but the most direct reading of the text suggests that she gave birth alone, helped only by Joseph, an old carpenter who had never witnessed a birth in his life. Think about it. A man in his 60s, trembling, holding the hand of a girl he barely knew, trying to remember everything he had heard other women in the family say about how to help a woman give birth, wiping the sweat from her forehead, whispering words of courage, praying, certainly, praying a lot. And Miriam, alone within her own body, went through that childbirth, for hours, perhaps 12 hours, perhaps 20. No one kept track of time. She bit her own arm to avoid screaming too loudly and attracting the other guests of the inn. She pulled her hair from the back of her neck when the contractions came strong. She vomited in the corner of the cave between one contraction and another. She lost control of her sphincters, as all women in labor do, and felt the shame of it even in the midst of the pain. She felt at some moment close to dawn that she was going to die. Every woman in labor feels that at some moment. Every woman. And then, in a gush of blood, amniotic fluid, and vital tissue, the baby came out. Joseph held him with trembling hands. He cut the cord with the carpenter's knife he used to carve fine wood. He cleaned the child with a piece of his own tunic because he had no clean cloth. And he placed the baby in Miriam's arms. And Miriam at that moment forgot the pain. Every mother forgets. Every mother, everywhere, in every century of human history, at the exact moment she first touches the skin of her newborn child, forgets. It is as if the hours of torment disappear instantly, and in their place enters a feeling that has no name in any language, but that every woman who has given birth recognizes. A feeling of recognition. A feeling of, ah, it's you. I've known you since before I saw you. The baby cried, loudly, the small lungs opening for the first time to the cold air of the world. Miriam wrapped him in swaddling clothes, the swaddling clothes that the Gospels mention, which were simply strips of cloth that every woman of that time prepared at home in the final months of pregnancy, precisely for this moment. There was no cradle. They improvised. Joseph dug out the straw from one of the empty mangers, covered it with the other half of his own cloak, and placed the baby there to sleep, while Miriam, exhausted, tried to catch her breath. That is how Jesus of Nazareth came into the world, not in a scene from a Baroque painting, with angels flying around and cherubs blowing trumpets, but in a stinking cave, with blood drying on the ground, with a 14-year-old mother almost fainting from exhaustion, and an old father crying silently in the corner, giving thanks to a God in whom he might have stopped fully trusting in the last months, but who that morning, with that living baby in the arms of the girl, he decided to trust again. And the shepherds? The shepherds came, yes. We do not know how many. We do not know exactly when. But it is historically plausible that shepherds from the nearby hills, upon seeing some commotion at the inn, upon hearing comments about a woman who had given birth in a cave behind the inn, came down to see with their own eyes. Shepherds, in that culture, were considered the lowest base of the social pyramid. So low that their testimony was not accepted in courts, so despised that stricter rabbis compared them to bandits. And it was these people, the most despised, the least trustworthy, the most marginal, who were the first to see Miriam's baby. This, if you pay attention, already contains a whole theology in itself. But Miriam, at that moment, was not thinking about theology. She was thinking about managing to breastfeed. And what about the wise men? Here is where the story needs to be clearly corrected, because popular tradition has crystallized a version that not even the Gospels themselves support. The text of Matthew, which is the only one that mentions the wise men, does not say how many there were. It could have been 2, 5, 12, 20. Later tradition decided that there were 3, because 3 gifts were mentioned, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, but that is deduction, not fact. And above all, the Gospel does not say that the wise men arrived that night, in the cave. It says, on the contrary, that they arrived at the house where Mary and the child were, implying that time had already passed, perhaps months, perhaps almost 2 years, according to the most accepted interpretation today, based on the fact that Herod, upon hearing from the wise men about the birth of a child, ordered the killing of all boys up to 2 years old in the region of Bethlehem. 2 years. Think about it. The wise men arrived when Jesus was already a small child, perhaps already walking, perhaps already babbling the first words. And Miriam, at 15, 16 years old at most, had already gotten used to motherhood. She had already gone through the first childhood fevers, the first nighttime cries, the first sleepless nights rocking a restless child. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let's go back to those first days in Bethlehem. They stayed in Bethlehem for some time. They did not return immediately to Nazareth. There are good reasons to believe that they remained in the region for weeks, perhaps months. Miriam needed to recover from childbirth. The baby needed to survive the first weeks. Which were the most dangerous? Joseph needed some temporary work in Bethlehem to support the family while they waited to be in a condition to make the journey back. And there was also the circumcision, which according to Jewish law should be done on the 8th day after birth, and the presentation at the temple, which should be done after 40 days. The presentation at the temple is a detail worth looking at carefully. According to the law of Moses, every mother who had given birth to a male child should, 40 days later, go to the temple in Jerusalem, which was about 10 kilometers from Bethlehem, and offer a purification sacrifice. The prescribed sacrifice was a lamb, but the law provided an exception for the poor. Those who could not afford a lamb could, in its place, offer 2 doves or 2 young pigeons. And what did Miriam offer, according to the Gospel of Luke? 2 doves. This small detail, almost hidden in the text, is one of the strongest historical proofs we have about the real economic situation of Jesus' family. They were not just poor. They were officially recognized as poor. They were so poor that they fell under the clause of the law reserved for the destitute. 2 doves, not a lamb, not 2 lambs. 2 doves, very cheap, sold in cheap cages by the merchants who stayed in the outer courtyard of the temple. And it was on that same day, in the courtyard of the temple in Jerusalem, with Miriam still weak from childbirth, holding the 40-day-old baby wrapped in simple cloths, that one of the most mysterious and most ignored scenes of the Gospels occurred. The encounter with Simeon. Simeon was an old man, very old. Tradition says he was over 100 years old. He was a man who lived in the temple waiting, without anyone explaining exactly what he was waiting for. On that specific morning when Miriam entered the courtyard with Joseph, Simeon approached, without warning, without ceremony, and took the baby from her arms. Miriam must have been paralyzed. Imagine this scene. A 14 or 15-year-old girl in a huge temple full of strangers, and an unknown old man approaching and taking her newborn child without asking for permission. Her heart must have stopped. But Simeon began to cry and to speak loudly to the baby. And he said things that Miriam did not understand. Things about the light of the nations, about the glory of Israel, about redemption. And then, before returning the child to her arms, Simeon looked into Miriam's eyes and said, with a terrible calm, "Thy sword will pierce your soul also." That was the gift that Simeon gave to Miriam that day. Not a blessing, not a glorious prophecy, a sentence, a promise of pain. And Miriam, according to the text, did not respond at all. She simply kept those words in her heart. But I assure you with all the certainty that 2,000 years of human reading can provide, that from that day on, she could never look at her own son again without feeling, deep in her back, a cold shiver. The prophecy of Simeon was fulfilled sooner than Miriam imagined, not decades later as she might have expected, not in a distant, symbolic, spiritual future, but in a matter of months, perhaps weeks. Because while Miriam was still processing those strange words from the old man in the temple, while she was still returning from Jerusalem to Bethlehem with the baby in her arms, trying to understand what it all meant, another man, much farther away, much more dangerous, was receiving a visit that would change everything. This man was Herod. Herod the Great, king of Judea by delegation from the Romans, was one of the most paranoid rulers in ancient history. He had ordered the death of his favorite wife. He had ordered the death of 3 of his own children, at different times in his life on charges of conspiracy. He had ordered the death of hundreds of military officials in his court on any suspicion of disloyalty. The Roman Emperor Augustus, according to a saying attributed to him, once commented that it was safer to be Herod's pig than to be Herod's son, a cruel pun, because the Jews did not eat pork, and therefore the pigs in Herod's household lived longer than his heirs. This was the man who ruled the region at that time. When the Magi from the east arrived at Herod's court, and they went to the court before going to Bethlehem, because being foreigners they needed to ask for information on where to find the newborn king of the Jews, Herod heard the story, feigned devoted interest, asked the Magi to return later to tell him where they found the child, and sent them off to Bethlehem. But Herod had no intention of worshipping any baby. The Magi, according to the Gospel, were warned in a dream not to return to the court. They took another route back to their countries, and Herod, realizing he had been deceived, flew into a rage that would go down in history, a rage that produced the darkest decree of all of Jesus' childhood, the massacre of all boys up to 2 years old in the region of Bethlehem. This episode, known in Christian tradition as the Massacre of the Innocents, is historically disputed. No Roman historian of the time explicitly mentions it, although many modern historians argue that this is understandable. Bethlehem was a small town. The number of boys of the targeted age would be modest, perhaps 20 or 30 children, and within the context of Herod's routine brutality, this episode might have gone unnoticed by the chroniclers who were busy recording the greater crimes of the tyrant. Other historians are more skeptical and see this episode as a theological creation of the Gospel of Matthew, projecting onto Jesus the symbolic parallel with Moses, who also survived a massacre of babies ordered by the Pharaoh of Egypt. I will not resolve this debate here. I cannot, no one can, with the absolute certainty that some would like. What I can say is this: regardless of whether the massacre was as extensive as Matthew describes, or whether it was a smaller event that was amplified by Christian memory, Miriam and Joseph fled. This indeed all sources confirm. They fled from Bethlehem in a moment of panic, in the middle of the night, with the baby wrapped up, without farewells, without warning the neighbors with whom they had lived for the past few months. And they fled to Egypt. Egypt. Think for a moment about what that word meant to a Jewish family in the 1st century. Egypt was the symbolic land of captivity. It was the place from which Moses had brought the ancestors, centuries before, after 400 years of slavery. It was the place where, according to the stories told in every Jewish home during Passover, the people had suffered the worst humiliations a people could suffer. To return to Egypt, even as temporary refugees, even to escape a threat, had a bitter, almost blasphemous historical flavor. It was to return to the place from which God had supposedly freed the people. It was to seek asylum from the very mythological executioner. But it was the only way out. Rome controlled all other directions. To the north, Galilee, where Miriam wanted to return, was under Herod's son, Herod Antipas, who could take orders from his father. To the east, the desert of Perea, under another son of Herod. To the west, the sea. Only to the south, Egypt, was outside the direct jurisdiction of the royal family. Egypt was the farthest Roman province, with its own prefect, its own bureaucracy, its own massive Jewish community. There were over 200,000 Jews in Alexandria at that time, forming perhaps the largest diaspora in the world. It was to this diaspora that Miriam fled. A 15-year-old girl with a few-month-old baby in her arms, married to an old carpenter she barely knew, leaving behind everything she knew to take refuge in a foreign country with a different culture, different language, different customs, with no certainty of when or if she could return. The journey to Egypt was worse than the trip to Bethlehem. It was almost 400 kilometers, crossing the Sinai Desert. In the middle of winter, or perhaps already at the beginning of spring, there is no way to know for sure. They would have to avoid the main roads where Roman patrols could interrogate them. They would have to pay Bedouin guides to cross the most dangerous areas. They would have to travel in small mixed caravans, hidden among merchants who asked no questions in exchange for a few coins. And the money? Where did the money for this journey come from? Here lies one of the rare coincidences underscored by tradition itself. The Magi, before leaving, had left the famous gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. The gold, specifically, was the currency of escape. Without that unexpected gold, coming from foreigners who appeared out of nowhere in their lives, Miriam and Joseph would never have had the resources to finance the flight to Egypt. They were, remember, so poor that they had offered 2 doves at the temple instead of a lamb. There was no savings, there was no reserve, but there was the gold from the Magi, and it was that gold that financed the family's survival in the months or years that followed. How long did they stay in Egypt? The Gospels do not say. Later tradition speaks of several years, perhaps 4, perhaps 5, perhaps 7. There are local legends in various Egyptian cities, especially in Alexandria and along the Nile Delta, that claim to have sheltered the Holy Family for months or years at different times. The Coptic Church, which is the native Christian church of Egypt, still maintains pilgrimage routes that traverse dozens of locations where supposedly Miriam, Joseph, and the boy would have passed. All of this is tradition, legend, faith, popular memory woven over the centuries. But the historical core, they were in Egypt, they stayed there for a reasonable time, is widely accepted. And what did Miriam do during that time? Think. A teenage new mother, in a foreign country, without family, without friends, without a support network. Joseph probably found work as a traveling carpenter in the towns where they stopped. Egypt at the time was experiencing economic growth, with various construction projects underway, and a skilled builder would find work without much difficulty. But money was tight, life was hard. Miriam would have learned, through hard experience, to survive in a place where no one spoke her language. She would have to buy food in markets where the vendors spoke Greek or Coptic or other languages she did not master. She would have to ask for directions from women who looked at her with the same suspicion that any community looks at poor foreigners. And it was during this exile that, according to what I firmly believe, some of the most formative moments of Miriam's personality occurred. She grew up quickly during those years. She grew more in the 5 years in Egypt than in the previous 14 years in Nazareth. She learned new things. She learned to depend only on her husband and herself. She learned to make decisions on her own. She learned, above all, to look at her son with different eyes. Because during those years away from Nazareth, away from the gossip, away from the torturous stares of the village where everyone knew the suspicious origin of that pregnancy, she could, for the first time, Just be a mother, without the weight of the previous history, without the whispers, without the son of Mary murmured behind her back. She was just a foreign mother in Egypt, and her son was just her son. She watched that boy grow in exile. He must have taken his first steps on Egyptian soil. He must have spoken his first words in a mix of Aramaic, the mother tongue that Miriam and Joseph spoke at home, with fragments of Greek and Coptic that he picked up in the streets where he played with other children. He was a bilingual child, perhaps trilingual, even before the age of 5. He was a child who knew that his family was different, that they had different hair, different food, a different day of rest. He was a child who probably asked his mother at some point during that exile why they were there, why they could not go back home, and Miriam, as I imagine with no way to prove, would have answered with that universal phrase of mothers who try to protect their children from truths too heavy for their age, because yes, my child, you will understand later. And one day, several years later, Joseph came home with news. Herod was dead. The news had taken a while to reach the Jewish community in Egypt, perhaps months, perhaps almost a year, because such things spread slowly among Roman provinces. But it had arrived. The tyrant was dead. The successor, Archelaus, was, according to the first reports, worse in some respects but more focused on Jerusalem and Judea, with less interest in distant Galilee. It was time to return. They packed the few belongings they had accumulated during their years in Egypt. They exchanged what they had for travel coins. They silently said goodbye to the Coptic and Jewish neighbors who had become, over that time, almost family. And they began the long walk back. But they would not return to Bethlehem. Bethlehem was in Judea, under Archelaus, the son who had inherited his father's worst instincts. They would return to Galilee, to the north, to Nazareth, to the village where it all began, and to the whispers that even after so many years waited for them, patiently, like embers beneath the ashes. Returning to Nazareth was harder than leaving Nazareth. The village had not changed at all. That is the point. Villages of that time did not change in 5, 10, 20 years. The same houses, the same faces, the same fig trees under which the elders discussed the same topics, the same women drawing water from the same well, at the same hours in the same way, and the same memories intact, frozen in time, waiting for the return of those who had disappeared to reactivate them. When Miriam appeared at the entrance of Nazareth, holding the hand of a 5- or 6-year-old boy, with Joseph beside her pulling a donkey loaded with the few possessions they had brought from Egypt, the entire village stopped. There was no celebration. There was no warm reception. There was curiosity. There were long, lingering looks, examining every detail, the face of the girl who was now a young woman, Joseph's graying beard, and above all, the boy. That boy. The boy about whom everyone had heard stories, even during the exile. Because in villages of that size, stories traveled. The relatives who stayed had received news from those who had fled. The women had exchanged information at the wells, on the paths, during visits to relatives from other villages. And the name of that child, the strange birth, the hurried flight, the prolonged exile, was already stitched, stitch by stitch, into the collective memory of the village even before the return. Joachim and Anna, Miriam's parents if they were still alive, and tradition says they were, although too old, embraced their daughter and grandson for the first time at the gate of their home and cried. They cried because they had survived to see that day. They cried because they had spent 5, 6, 7 years not knowing if their daughter was alive, if their grandson was alive, if their daughter's elderly husband was still breathing, because letters at that time between Egypt and Galilee were a rare, slow, expensive thing. News traveled by word of mouth, in caravans, in pilgrimages, and could take months to arrive, when they arrived. But along with the relief of the reunion, the old weight returned. The neighbors smiled, yes. They greeted, yes. They said polite phrases about how the boy had grown, how Miriam was well, how good it was to see the family back. But the looks were still those. The same looks she had known at 13 when her belly had begun to show. The same mental calculations behind every smile. The same unasked questions but thought, does he look like Joseph or not? Does his hair have the color of her family or another family? How old exactly is he now, and does that match the date of the marriage? Miriam, now in her 20s or a little older, received those looks with a dignity different from what she had at 13. Exile had hardened something inside her. It had not made her bitter. All later accounts describe her as a woman of serene kindness, but it had made her someone who no longer looked down in the same way, who responded to greetings firmly, who looked at the neighbors with the calm of someone who had faced worse things than whispers. She had seen the desert. She had seen Egypt. She had seen real hunger. She had seen real fear. Village gossip no longer had the same power over her. And it was in this Miriam hardened by life that Joseph, a few years after the return, approached her again as a husband. There is no way to date the birth of the other children precisely, but the indications point to a relatively close sequence over perhaps 10 or 15 years. James, the first of the other children, would have been born probably when Jesus was 7 or 8 years old. Joseph, the second, 2 or 3 years later. Judas, a few more years. Simon later, and the daughters, at least 2, perhaps more, scattered among them. Imagine that house. Imagine the clay and stone house in the lower part of Nazareth, now full of children. 6, 7, 8 children running around the courtyard. The youngest hanging onto the hem of Miriam's dress while she tried to knead bread. The older ones going out to help Joseph in the workshop, learning to handle chisels, gouges, planes. The laughter, the fights, the cries, the scraped knees, the viral fevers that passed from sibling to sibling during the winter, the first teeth that fell out, the first words of the little ones, the permanent smell of baking bread, of hot oil, of wet clothes drying in the sun, of a child's hair not washed for 2 days. This was the real Miriam, not the lonely woman of the paintings. The matriarch of a large family, exhausted, divided among 20 tasks at once, with hair escaping from her veil, with hands cracked from endless domestic work, with bags under her eyes from sleepless nights. A woman in her 30s, 40s, aging quickly, like all women of that culture aged quickly, but firm as a rock. And at the center of that large family, that daily commotion, was the firstborn. Different. The siblings noticed the difference very early. Children always notice. They knew that that older brother, Yeshua in the original pronunciation, or Jesus in the Greek transliteration, was treated a little differently by the parents, not with more love. Miriam loved all her children equally. All evidence points to that. But with something more, a subtle reverence, a special care. The parents spoke softly at night when they thought the children were asleep, and sometimes the older siblings caught snippets of conversation. He said that again today, or he asked about the temple again, or should we tell him? Tell him what? That was the mystery of Miriam's house. There was something that she and Joseph knew about the firstborn that they did not tell the other children. Something related to his birth, to the reason for the flight to Egypt, to the prophecy of that old man in the temple. And the siblings felt without understanding that there was an invisible boundary between the older brother and the others, a boundary that would eventually generate within the family deep resentments. The canonical Gospels later record moments when Jesus' brothers mock him, doubt him, suggest that he has some form of madness, want him to be quiet to stop embarrassing the family with strange speeches. These feelings did not arise from nowhere. They came from an entire childhood in which the older brother had been the different child, the mysterious child, the child of the untold story. And Miriam, divided among the children, lived the impossible. To love them all equally, and at the same time carry within her the secret of that firstborn. A secret that was slowly destroying her, because a secret of that size cannot fit in any human chest without cracking it. What kind of boy was Jesus? Here is where we know very little, and where many later traditions wanted to fill the gaps with legends, some touching, others absurd, others frankly disturbing. There is an apocryphal gospel called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, probably written in the 2nd century, which presents the young Jesus as a kind of violent prodigy child, capable of striking down other boys who annoyed him with a word, of resurrecting clay birds with a breath, of frightening even his own parents with his uncontrolled powers. It is a disturbing text, and for that reason the official church never included it in the canon. But the fact that it was written shows that, in the early centuries, there was a huge fascination with the question, what must his childhood have been like? What would Miriam and Joseph have witnessed within that house? The more sober historical answer is probably this. He was a child like others in many respects, but with some disconcerting depth. The only episodes of his childhood that survived in the canonical Gospels are episodes of uncommon intelligence, of uncommon seriousness, of an almost adult capacity to think about things that other children did not think about. The most well-known episode is that of the boy at 12 years old, in the temple, in Jerusalem. The whole family had gone to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover, an annual trip that devout Jewish families made, a week-long pilgrimage, with the entire village community traveling together in caravan. It was a crowd, hundreds of people from Nazareth and surrounding areas walking together, with women separated from men for part of the journey, with children running between the groups, with teenagers beginning to transition between the world of children and the world of adults. When the caravan returned from Jerusalem after the feast, Miriam and Joseph discovered, at the end of the first day of walking, that Jesus, now a 12-year-old boy at the age limit between child and adult by Jewish tradition, was not with them. He was not with the other relatives. He was not with the other boys from the village. No one had seen him since Jerusalem. Imagine Miriam's panic. She now had other small children to care for, probably 4 or 5 already, but she ran back to Jerusalem with Joseph. 3 whole days of searching, 3 days looking for a child in a gigantic city, crowded with pilgrims, under the scorching spring sun. 3 days in which Miriam did not sleep, did not eat, barely drank water. 3 days in which she imagined all the things a mother imagines when she loses a 12-year-old child in a strange city. Had he been kidnapped, sold as a slave, died in some accident, fallen from some roof, been attacked by a gang of bandits? And where did she find him? In the temple, talking with the teachers of the law, sitting among elderly rabbis, asking questions, giving answers, leaving the old scholars perplexed with the depth of what he said. Miriam, according to the account, came to him and said, with a mixture of relief and absolutely human anger, "Son, why have you done this to us? Your father and I have been searching for you in anguish." And Jesus replied, and that answer has crossed the centuries, "Why were you searching for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house?" Miriam, according to the Gospel of Luke, did not understand the answer. But I tell you with all the clarity that 2,000 years of reading can offer, she understood, yes, she understood perfectly. She understood at that moment in the temple courtyard, with her heart still racing from 3 days of panic, that her son was beginning to drift away. That the secret she had kept since that first impossible pregnancy was beginning to sprout, come to the surface, find its own words in the mouth of that growing boy, and that from that day on she would be just the mother, not the confidant, not the guide, just the mother, watching, from a distance, the son she had borne begin to belong to something greater than herself. The sword that Simeon had prophesied was beginning to move slowly toward her soul. The 18 years that followed that episode in the temple are the greatest silence in the history of Christianity. 18 whole years, from 12 to 30. Almost 2 decades about which none of the canonical Gospels say a single word, as if that time had been erased from memory, as if nothing important had happened, as if Jesus had simply entered a cocoon somewhere and emerged from it already an adult, already ready, already preaching by the banks of the Jordan River. But for Miriam, those 18 years were a lifetime. They were the years in which she saw her son grow in the day-to-day of the workshop, learning from Joseph to handle tools, to saw wood, to polish stone, to understand the proportions of a beam, the angle of a joint, the correct weight of a hammer. They were the years in which she saw the boy's body transform into the body of a man. Broad shoulders, calloused hands, dark beard beginning to appear on the face she still remembered as the face of the baby she had nursed in a cave in Bethlehem. And they were, above all, the years in which she buried Joseph. The Bible does not tell exactly when Joseph died, but his complete absence in all subsequent narratives of Jesus' ministry points to a death that occurred during those silent years. probably when Jesus was between 15 and 25 years old. Joseph had already been old from the beginning. He must have been by then 70, 80 years old, perhaps more. A body worn out from decades of manual labor. A body that was giving way, year after year, until one ordinary morning he did not wake up. Imagine Miriam at that moment, a woman perhaps 30 years old, perhaps 35, a widow with 7 or 8 children to support. In the culture of that time, being a widow was one of the worst possible fates for a woman. Without a husband, she lost practically all legal rights. She could not inherit his workshop. It automatically passed to the oldest male child. She could not conduct business on her own. She depended on the goodwill of her oldest son to survive, and on the goodwill of her deceased husband's relatives to not be thrown into absolute misery. And her oldest son, at that moment, was Jesus. It was Jesus, therefore, who took over Joseph's workshop. It was Jesus who suddenly became the head of a large family. It was Jesus who had to support his widowed mother, his younger brothers, the sisters who were still waiting to marry. It was Jesus, in those silent years that no one tells you about, who got up every morning to light the oven, open the workshop, receive customers, negotiate prices, deliver furniture to neighboring villages, calculate debts, pay Roman taxes. And Miriam, alongside him, was the silent matriarch of that machinery. She ran the house while he ran the workshop. She cared for the younger children, while he taught the trade to the middle siblings. She kept the family together during years in which many heavy things could have shattered them. And during that time, mother and son developed a silent, deep complicity that few mothers and few children managed to develop. They had been through everything together: the cave, the exile, the return, the whispers, the loss of Joseph. And now, together, they sustained what remained. But there was one thing that Miriam knew, and that she had known for a long time, even without wanting to think about it. This would not last. She perceived in her son's eyes, during the silent meals, during the walks to the well, during the nights when he sat alone on the doorstep looking at the hills, that there was something growing inside him, an unease, an internal certainty that he had not yet named. But that grew with each passing year. He read more scriptures than the other men in the village. He asked strange questions of visiting rabbis. He would sometimes stop in the middle of work and stare off into space for whole minutes, holding a tool as if he had forgotten it in his hand. Miriam recognized that. It was the same silent depth that she herself had carried since she was a girl. The same difference that the neighbors had always perceived in her. Only now, in her son, that was transforming into something much greater, something that would break the cocoon of the village, something that she could not contain, even if she wanted to. And there were moments, I suspect, when she did want to, when she prayed for it to pass, when she asked God to let that son be just a carpenter from Nazareth, marry a good girl, give her grandchildren, grow old there in peace, far from temples, prophecies, swords piercing souls. But God, if she prayed that, did not answer. One ordinary morning, after 18 years of silence, Jesus laid down the hammer on the workbench. He took off the leather apron. He looked at his mother, who was in the corner grinding wheat, as she had done since she was 5 years old. He said something brief. "Perhaps I need to go to the Jordan. They say there is a prophet there. Perhaps not even that. Perhaps just a silent hug." And he left. He did not return to stay. And Miriam, standing at the door of the house, watching her oldest son disappear around the bend of the road that led out of the village, felt at that moment the first blade of that ancient sword begin, finally, to enter. The first months after Jesus left home were the strangest of Miriam's life. She continued with her routine. She lit the oven before dawn. She ground the wheat. She cared for the younger children. But there was an empty chair at the table. There was an empty mat in the corner of the room. There was the silence of the workshop, now run by James, the second son, who had inherited the tools from the older brother, with that mixture of pride and resentment that every second child carries. And the news began to arrive. They came in pieces. Merchants who stopped in Nazareth told that they had seen, at the Jordan, a man named John baptizing crowds, and among those crowds a quiet Galilean who had been pointed out by John himself as someone special. Pilgrims returning from Judea said they had heard of a new preacher, young, who walked along the shores of the Sea of Galilee, gathering disciples among the fishermen of Capernaum. A cousin of Miriam, upon returning from a visit to relatives in Bethsaida, asked carefully, "This Yeshua, they say, has been working miracles over there. Wouldn't he be your son, Miriam?" Miriam replied only with a brief nod and continued grinding the wheat. But inside her, something was simultaneously igniting and extinguishing. It ignited because it was her son. It was her blood running those paths. It was her voice, echoed in his voice, now being heard by strangers. It extinguished because she knew where that would end. She always knew. Since the old man in the temple, since the night in the cave, since perhaps even before that. And there was a moment, at the beginning of it all, when she still tried to pull him back into her world. It was at the wedding at Cana. Cana was a few kilometers from Nazareth. A family friend was marrying off a daughter, and Miriam was invited. She took the younger children, and Jesus, who had already begun his itinerant ministry, also went with some of the disciples he had gathered in the previous months. It was the first time that mother and son saw each other together at a common social event since he had left. You know the story of the miracle, the water turned into wine. But what few notice, when reading carefully, is the small dialogue between the two before the miracle happens. The wine for the feast ran out. Miriam noticed before the bride and groom, because women notice these things, and she approached her son, not the servants, not the master of ceremonies, her son, and simply said, "They have no more wine." Just that. But within those 4 words was a mother testing her son. It was a veiled request. It was a do something. It was perhaps a silent way of calling her son back to the world of common concerns, common problems, common solutions. It was Miriam saying, without saying, "You are still my son. You still belong to this house, to these people, to these small human dramas." Jesus' response was cold. "Woman, what have I to do with you? My hour has not yet come." Woman, not mother. Woman, in Greek, gynai, a polite word, but distant. The same word he would use years later when addressing strangers. The same word he would use in the final moment, hanging on the cross when speaking to her for the last time. At that moment, in Cana, in the midst of the wedding feast, with the smell of food and wine and sweat from the dances, Miriam received in her face the first bitter lesson of the new world. The son she had borne, nursed, carried through the deserts of Egypt, sustained after Joseph's death, that son was no longer her property. He was no longer even part of her in the intimate sense of before. He now belonged to something else, to a mission, to a calling, to a father different from the one who had died in Nazareth. And Miriam, instead of crying, instead of walking away hurt, did something extraordinary. She turned to the servants of the feast and said, "Do whatever he tells you." Just that. In other words, she accepted. She swallowed the woman. She swallowed the new distance. She swallowed the fact that that son was no longer hers. And with a dignity that few mothers in history have had, she transferred her authority to him. She told the servants to obey. She silently said that she accepted her new place, no longer the guiding mother, but a witness, no longer the protagonist, but someone who stood by, observing. The miracle happened. The wine flowed. The feast continued. But something between her and her son had been sealed forever in that brief exchange of words. And Miriam, returning to Nazareth a few days later, knew that she had seen the beginning. Not the beautiful beginning that painters would later portray, with crystal-clear waters and golden jugs. The real beginning. The one in which a mother feels, for the first time with absolute clarity, that her son is walking towards something from which she will never be able to protect him. Months passed, then a year, then almost 2, and the news that reached Nazareth became, at the same time, more spectacular and more concerning. They said he had healed a leper just by touching him. They said he had made a paralytic stand up in front of an entire crowd. They said he had fed thousands of people with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. They said he had walked on the waters of the Sea of Galilee on a stormy night. They said he had cast out demons. They said, above all, that he was speaking things that no rabbi had ever dared to speak, confronting Pharisees, challenging Sadducees, forgiving sins as if he had the authority to do so. Miriam heard all of this on the edges of the well, from neighbors, from relatives who came to visit with eager eyes for news. And the brothers of Jesus, James, Joseph, Judas, Simon, heard it too. And the brothers were not pleased. It is a detail that the canonical Gospels preserve, even against the will of later theology. At a certain moment recorded by Mark, the brothers of Jesus left Nazareth to look for him. The declared intention was one, to bring him back, by force, if necessary. Because, according to the text itself, they said he was out of his mind, that he had gone crazy, that he was embarrassing the family, that he needed to be restrained before he got into worse trouble, and Miriam went with them. That is the detail that hurts. That is the detail that later tradition tried to soften in 1,000 ways. That is the detail that very few sermons in modern churches mention. But it is there, written in all letters. The mother went along. The mother agreed with the mission of the brothers. The mother accepted to walk kilometers to where Jesus was preaching, to cross crowds, and to try to take him away by the hand, as one takes a child off the street who is causing a scene. Why? Because Miriam, at that moment, was afraid. Concrete, real, practical fear. The religious authorities were already starting to speak ill of her son. The Pharisees had come from Judea to investigate him. The Herodians were watching with hostility. Rome was always keeping an eye on any popular movement that could turn into a revolt. Miriam had lived long enough to know how those stories ended. She had seen in her youth men being crucified on the roads of Galilee for much less than what her son was doing now. And the idea of losing him, of seeing him imprisoned, whipped, condemned, executed, was more than she could bear. So she went. She walked alongside her other children, holding the hem of her dress, during the long journey to the house in Capernaum where Jesus was teaching. And when they arrived, they found a crowd so dense around the door that it was impossible to enter. They had to send a message through other people. Your mother and your brothers are outside asking to speak with you. And Jesus' response, relayed from the house to the outside, was the most painful phrase a mother could hear. Who is my mother? Who are my brothers? And looking at those who were sitting around him, he added, Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother, my sister, and my mother. Miriam heard that phrase from the outside, and the younger children heard it too. And the curious neighbors who had followed the caravan from Nazareth heard it, and from that moment on, the story of that scene spread throughout all of Galilee. The story of a mother publicly rejected by her own son in front of a crowd. Was it cruel? Perhaps it was, or perhaps it was not cruel but necessary. Perhaps Jesus, at that moment, was doing something much deeper than rejecting his mother. Perhaps he was saying that the bond he proposed between people, the bond of shared faith, of common spirit, of conscious choice, was as real as the bond of blood. Perhaps he was expanding the concept of mother to include more people in it. Perhaps he was, ultimately, teaching his own mother that she could only be with him if she accepted to be not only the biological mother, but the first disciple. But at that moment, there with tired feet from the journey, with sweat dripping down her veil, with the younger children looking at her waiting for a reaction, Miriam received those words like a door being closed. She returned to Nazareth. There is no record that she tried to take him away from the crowd again, and from that day on she learned the hardest thing a mother can learn, to love a child from afar, to follow his life without participating in it, to hear news of him from others, to pray for him in silence in the kitchen while kneading bread, to wait, just wait. And to trust, or try to trust, that that different son, that impossible son, that son she had born in a cave in Bethlehem one long ago night, knew where he was going. The end approached slowly, and at the same time, too quickly. 3 years. That was roughly the duration of Jesus' public ministry, according to the chronological reconstruction scholars make of the Gospels. 3 springs, 3 summers, 3 autumns, 3 winters. And in each season, Miriam heard different news. At first they were news of astonishment, in the middle news of controversy, In the end, news of increasing danger. The Pharisees had openly turned against him. The high priests in Jerusalem were already meeting in secret councils to discuss what to do with that Galilean who insisted on calling God his Father as if he were intimate with him, who forgave sins as if he had the right, who entered the temple overturning the tables of money changers, who walked with fishermen, prostitutes, tax collectors, and said that these were the people who would enter the kingdom before the doctors of the law. Miriam did not need to hear the details. It was enough to hear the tones, and the tones were getting darker and darker. At some point during that third spring, she made a decision. She decided to go to Jerusalem, not to try to contain him again, not to take him away from the crowd. She had already learned that this was not possible. But to be close, just that. To be in the same city, in the same air, in the same time. To not receive the news, any news, whatever it was, through the mouths of others. If something happened to that son, she wanted to be there. She wanted, if possible, to see with her own eyes. She packed a small bundle, left the younger children in the care of the older daughters, who were already married with their own homes, and joined a group of Galilean pilgrims who were going to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover that year. It was a strange journey, different from all the other pilgrimages she had made in her life, because now on the way, at every inn, at every well where they stopped to rest, in every village they passed through, she heard her son's name on the lips of others. People talked about him, debated about him, defended, condemned, prophesied, mocked, and no one there knew that that middle-aged woman, thin with a veil covering her grey hair, sitting in a corner of the inn, eating bread in silence, was his mother. She listened to everything, and said nothing. When she arrived in Jerusalem, the city was in a frenzy. It was Passover week, the biggest religious festival of the year, when the city's population quadrupled with pilgrims coming from all regions, and at the center of all the commotion, being spoken of in all the streets, in all the temple courtyards, in all the markets, was the name of Yeshua of Nazareth, who had entered the city a few days before riding on a donkey, with crowds spreading cloaks and branches in his path. Miriam found a place to stay, probably at the house of some distant relative, or of some supporter of her son, or in one of the makeshift lodgings that were set up during the festival, and she began to wait. She did not seek Jesus directly. She did not try to see him. She knew he was busy, surrounded, watched. She also knew that if she tried to get close, she might be rejected again, and her heart could not bear another rejection. So she stayed where she was and listened. She heard about the expulsion of the money changers from the temple. She heard about the heated debates with the Pharisees. She heard about the anointing in Bethany. She heard about the secret supper he had with the disciples on a Thursday night. And she heard on Friday morning before dawn the first rumor. He had been arrested during the night in the Garden of Gethsemane by a troop of temple guards with the help, they said, of one of his own disciples, a man named Judas Iscariot, who had betrayed him for 30 pieces of silver. Miriam heard this in the street from the mouth of a woman returning from the market, and the whole world around her fell silent. She did not cry at that moment. Mothers rarely cry in the first instant. The tears come later in waves. In the first instant, there is only a cold sensation descending down the spine, as if life were being drained from the inside out. She stood up, covered her face with the veil, and began to walk toward Pilate's praetorium, where they said he had been taken. Not to intervene, not to plead. She already knew there was nothing more to be done, but to be there, so that he, at some moment that day, when looking out the window or being dragged down the street, could see his mother's face in the midst of the crowd. Just that, so that he would know without needing words that she had come, that she was there, that whatever they did to him, he was not alone. It was the only thing a mother could offer, and it was the only thing she offered that longest day of her life. The sword entered, not in the soul. That was the poetic way of saying it. The sword entered somewhere much more physical, in the depths of her chest beneath the ribs, where the real pain of mothers resides when they lose a child. That place that has no name in any language, but that every grieving mother recognizes forever after she knows. It was around 9 o'clock in the morning when Miriam found the procession. He was carrying a piece of the cross, the horizontal beam, because the vertical one was already fixed at the top of the hill, waiting. His face was unrecognizable. The scourges from the previous night had opened the skin of his back in deep grooves, and blood had flowed down the front, the side, the legs. The crown of thorns that the Roman soldiers had improvised in mockery, because he had been called king, had driven 20-30 sharp points into his scalp. His entire face was a mask of dried blood mixed with fresh blood. Miriam saw him from the edge of the street and recognized him by the shape of his shoulder, not by his face, by his shoulder. That left shoulder a little higher than the right, a family mark that she had seen on him since he was a baby. It was the shoulder that told her, before her eyes could absorb the rest of the image. It's him. It's my son. She tried to move forward. The Roman soldiers pushed her back. She tried again, was pushed back again. The people around her were shouting, some cursing the condemned man, others lamenting, others simply curious. Miriam, in the midst of all that, was just another shadow covered by a brown veil. And it was at that moment that he saw her. His eyes, glazed with pain, met hers in the crowd. For a fraction of a second, it may have been a whole second, it may have been a lifetime concentrated in a single instant. They looked at each other, mother and son, for the last time standing among the living. He said nothing. He could not, even if he wanted to. His mouth was cracked, his tongue swollen, his breath was a gasp. But his gaze said something. And Miriam, instead of screaming, instead of falling, instead of doing any of the things other mothers would have done, did that one thing she had learned to do since she was a 13-year-old girl in a forgotten village in Galilee. She stood, just stood, straight, firm, looking back, without looking away, and followed the procession to Golgotha. The ascent to the place of crucifixion took about an hour. They crossed the city gate, took the dusty road that rose toward the hill. The soldiers cursed, laughed, led with the professional indifference of those who did this several times a month. The condemned, because there were 3, not just 1, but 3 men marked to die that day, walked or fell, and when they fell, they were lifted with whips. Miriam followed behind, not crying out loud, just walking, with her feet one in front of the other, mechanically, as if her body had disconnected from everything that was not that single objective. To reach the top, to be there when the hammer fell on the nails. At the top she stopped, not too far, not too close, at a distance where she could see his face, but where the soldiers would not push her if she remained silent. There were other women with her, Mary Magdalene, Mary the wife of Clopas, and the disciple John, the youngest of them, the only one of the 12 who had had the courage to appear at Golgotha. The others had fled. Peter had denied 3 times the night before. Judas, it was said, had hanged himself with a belt on a fig tree, but Miriam had not fled. Miriam was there. The soldiers nailed him to the cross. The nails were long, forged iron, about 15 centimeters long, driven into the wrists, not the palms, as later images would show, but the wrists, because the flesh of the palms would not support the weight of the body. Each hammer blow produced a dull, muffled sound, followed by a scream. Miriam heard each of those hammer blows as if they were being driven into her own body. The cross was raised, fitted into the hole in the ground, violently shaken until it was firm, and his body hung there, suspended, between heaven and earth, before the eyes of his mother. The agony of crucifixion lasted approximately 6 hours. At some point during those 6 hours, he looked at Miriam at the foot of the cross, looked at John beside her, and said, with a voice already almost extinguished, spending what little breath remained to say that specific phrase, "Woman, here is your son," and to John, "Here is your mother." These were the last words he directed to her, and notice the detail. Woman. The same word from Cana, the same word that had hurt so many years before, at the beginning of it all. He had called her woman at his first public appearance, and he called her woman at the last, as if he wanted, at the beginning and the end, to remind her and remind himself that she was, yes, a mother, but she was also much more than a mother. She was a woman, whole, with her own story, with her own soul, with a destiny that did not end there on the cross along with his. He was transferring her care to John because he knew, even at the height of agony, that she would need someone. The other children, James, Joseph, Judas, Simon, had not yet converted to that path. They still thought he had gone mad. They were not there. And Miriam, a widow about to lose her firstborn, would be alone. John, the youngest disciple, was the only one who had had the courage to stay until the end. So John would be, from then on, her son. Around 3 in the afternoon, he breathed his last. Miriam did not faint, did not scream. She just continued standing, although her legs had been trembling for hours. John held her by the arm. She did not move. She stayed there looking at the dead body of her son, suspended between heaven and earth, until the soldiers began to lower the bodies to remove them before sunset, because, according to Jewish law, no body could be left exposed on the Sabbath. And when they lowered his body, Miriam took 3 steps forward, extended her arms, and received for the last time in her lap the son she had borne in a cave one long-ago night. And here ends the story that no one told you, because what came after the cross in Miriam's real life is the greatest silence of the Gospels. We know she was there on the day of the resurrection, according to some traditions. We know she was gathered with the apostles at Pentecost, according to the book of Acts, which mentions her one last time briefly as Mary, the mother of Jesus, among the women who prayed with the 11. And after that, silence. Absolute. Definitive. How long did she live after her son's death? 5 years? 15? 25? No one knows. Where did she die? Some traditions say in Ephesus, where she would have accompanied the Apostle John in the last years of her life. Others say in Jerusalem. Others say in a small house in the hills, far from everything. How did she die? Sick? Old? At peace? Alone? No one knows. And it is in that gap, that huge hole in the middle of the story, that the Church began to build slowly over the following centuries the figure you inherited. They invented the Immaculate Conception. In the 19th century, 1874 years after her death, they decided in a council that she herself had been conceived without sin to become a worthy womb for the Son. They invented the Assumption in the 20th century. 1950 years later, they decided in another council that she had been taken up to heaven in body and soul, without undergoing the common death of other mortals. They invented perpetual virginity. They invented the title of Mother of God. They invented the Queen of Heaven. They invented the blue mantle, the Immaculate Heart, the tears that flow from statues, the apparitions, the shrines, the rosaries, the prayers repeated in millions of mouths. And in each of these inventions they pushed the real Miriam a little further away. The scared 13-year-old girl, the exhausted mother of 7 children, the widow who buried her old husband, the woman who stood at the foot of the cross watching her firstborn die. In each new dogma, they covered her true face with another layer of golden paint. Why did they do this? Because a woman like Miriam, real flesh and blood, was too dangerous. A woman who had borne the sacred within a common body meant that the sacred could fit in any common body. It meant that other women could bear the sacred. It meant that the sacred did not exclusively belong to temples, to priests, to men who controlled religion. It meant, and this was the most dangerous thing of all, that the sacred dwelled where life happened. In kitchens, in births, in the linings of poor houses, in the laps of tired mothers. And a church that was being built by men, regulated by men, hierarchized by men, could not coexist with that idea. So they turned her into a statue, and handed you the statue, and taught you for 20 centuries to kneel before the statue, to light candles for the statue, to ask for intercession from the statue, to believe that the statue had always been like that. Perfect, white, blue, without body, without sweat, without doubt, without anger, without anything that could remind one of a real woman. But the real Miriam is beneath that marble. She is there, whole, waiting. For 2,000 years waiting for someone at some moment to have the courage to scrape off the gold, scrape off the paint, scrape off the dogma, and look at her face as it really was. The brown face, the tired eyes, the cracked hands, the rough veil, the ancient pain etched in the wrinkles of her forehead, the silent courage of one who went through everything she went through without ever having the right to protest out loud. That face is the gift I wanted to give you today. Not to take anything away from your faith if you have faith, not to profane anything that is sacred to you, but to return, after 20 centuries, something that was stolen, not from her, because she no longer needs any return, but from all the other women who came after her, and who for 2,000 years were taught to look at an impossible statue as if it were the model to be followed. Women who tried and who failed, because no one can be a statue. No one can be an eternal virgin. No one can be without pain, without body, without doubt. The real Miriam, on the contrary, is attainable. She is a poor girl who survived. She is a mother who lost a child and remained standing. She is a widow who supported a household. She is a woman who learned, slowly, to love a son who did not belong to her. She is a witness silenced by men who were afraid of what she might say if she opened her mouth. And she is, perhaps, the name of someone in your family, your mother, your grandmother, your great-grandmother, the silenced woman of your family tree, about whom no one wants to talk properly, the one who carried stories in her chest and died without anyone having the patience to sit with her and ask, "Tell me how it really was." Perhaps this is the Miriam that survives, not in the statues of cathedrals, not in the processions, not in the dogmas, but in every woman who, at some moment in history, was too great for the world she received, and was reduced to some form of silence so that this world could continue spinning comfortably. And perhaps at the end of this story, the only thing left for you to do is exactly this. Remember. Remember that, before any holiness, there was a girl named Miriam, that she was afraid, that she was hungry, that she loved, that she lost, and that she in silence changed the world.